It is time for December Patreon birthday shoutouts, and I want to say a very happy birthday to my December patrons. Happy birthday to Alyssa, Allison, Elise, Shashi, Heather, Lori, Noelle, Jack, Maria, Kilogram Jam, Carolyn, Renata, Camila, and Aaron from the Generation Y podcast. Here's to another year of chasing dreams, creating memories, and embracing the journey ahead. From me to you, I want to wish you a happy birthday. A couple moved to an uninhabited island in the Galapagos, but they wouldn't be alone forever. When more settlers arrived, tensions rose and left us with multiple mysteries nearly 90 years later. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Welcome to Crimelines and today's 12 Days of Crimelines episode. Today, my kids are home and they're doing construction on our street, so this should be a really fun recording session. The case today is one that I learned about years ago when I watched a documentary from 2013 called The Galapagos Affair. I wrote about it for the podcast Rusty Hinges, so if you've listened to that show, you've definitely heard the lighter version of this case. I don't do topics this old on Crimelines usually, so I hope no one minds me sneaking in one every year or so. This isn't really one of those historic unsolved cases that has any hope of being solved due to the circumstances. We'll get into it, but it is an interesting look at human motivations. As such, we are primarily going to talk about the backgrounds of everyone that we have information for. To set up what happened and why, we need to start with a German man named Dr. Friedrich Ritter. Friedrich was born in about 1886. I told you this was historic. And he grew up in a small town near Germany's Black Forest. He had a very comfortable upbringing, and he was a studious child, eventually going to medical school. When he was 20, he married Mila Clark, who some reports say would eventually become an opera singer. In his free time, Friedrich read a lot, and he was a huge fan of reading philosophy. He was largely influenced by the writings of Nietzsche, and it led him to thinking about what life would look like outside of marital and societal pressures, a life free to just pursue and develop his own life philosophy while he lived off the land and became what is known as the Übermensch. The Übermensch is hard to directly translate into English. Sometimes it's translated simply as Superman, but that then conjures up visions of a comic book character. Some have used beyond a man, but the idea is that Uber gives the idea of being superior, and Mensch means person. When it's translated to English as man, it means more like mankind or human beings, not gendered. The idea is written about in a book about a man who leaves his comfortable life at a lake house and goes up to the mountains to live for the earth. Essentially, the goal of becoming the best human isn't in working for the promise of a better afterlife, but in giving meaning to the life we have here. The philosophy of the Übermensch has been used in a number of ways by a number of people. Anarchists have used it as it was about living free from societal and religious restrictions. Nazis used it to promote their idea of a superior race while ignoring the anti-nationalism message of the concept. Furthermore, Nietzsche once wrote that all anti-Semites ought to be shot, so to have his philosophy tied to Nazism in some people's minds to this day means that Hitler's propaganda is still working nearly 80 years after his death. But I digress. Friedrich Ritter interpreted Nietzsche's work in a very literal way. His feelings about it were compounded by his own successful medical practice in Berlin. The more money he made, the more he felt tied to society. He had a cognitive dissonance where he wanted simplicity but found himself enjoying the comforts of the world. He was also not happy in his marriage, and in the 1920s, he started an affair with Dora Strock. Dora was 15 years younger than him and one of his patients. She had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and was trying to find a doctor who would treat her after others had basically turned her away, saying there was little they could do. She was willing to try pretty much anything, including a surgery that left her unable to have children. She wanted a cure beyond just managing her symptoms, and she was hospitalized when she met Friedrich. She was also married to a man who was 22 years older than her. Friedrich looked at Dora's chart while she was in the hospital, and he told her that he could cure her through the power of the mind. If she followed his teachings, he could educate her on healing her body using a method that is basically meditation. Willing to try anything, she started going to Friedrich's office daily for lessons as she pursued this cure. Eventually, at one of those appointments, Friedrich kissed her. Now, he told her he wasn't sure why he kissed her since he wasn't actually in love with her. He confessed he was in love with someone else, but not his wife. Freeing himself from religious and social norms, Friedrich felt comfortable that he was actually in love with his own niece, who was 20 years younger than him. For some reason, Dora accepted this as part of their relationship. It's possible it's because the dynamic between the two had Friedrich as the teacher, the master, the one who knew and understood everything. She was simply the student, and she accepted whatever he offered her. It's also possible she was in love with him, and sometimes we put up with a lot when we're in love. Dora came to believe that they were meant to be together regardless of who they loved and regardless of who they were already married to. The two started an affair, and over the next 2 years, they came up with plans to leave Germany. The rise of nationalism and the Nazi Party certainly played a role in this. The Nazi goal was to replace religion and class with a national community where everyone held the same exact beliefs, and that went against Friedrich's view of being a free person. They talked about living separate from the modern world and living off the land where they could have a mostly raw food diet. Not only would it help Friedrich's mind, allowing him to write his personal philosophy, but they believed it would cure Dora's MS. The question of where to go was answered when Friedrich read the 1924 book Galapagos World's End by William Beebe. Located about 1,000 kilometers west of Ecuador, the Galapagos archipelago contains 61 islands, though many are very small, not much more than a bunch of rocks. The largest island is half the size of the island of Hawaii, and not all of the islands are even inhabitable due to lack of fresh water. So Friedrich did some research and settled on the island of Floriana because it checked all the boxes for him. First and foremost, it was uninhabited at that point, so he and Dora would live there entirely alone. That's not to say that they were the first to live there. The first documented Galapagos resident was a man named Patrick Watkins, who lived on Floriana from 1807 to 1809. Some reports are that he wasn't there voluntarily, but rather he had been stranded there. But then in 1832, Ecuador laid claim and attempted to use Floriana as a penal colony. But while there is fresh water on the island, it was not enough to consistently sustain a large population. There was a brief attempt later to run a fish canning plant on the island in about 1924, but it didn't last long. Another reason Friedrich liked the idea of Floriana was that it was relatively flat, so it had pools of fresh water, which is always a challenge on small islands. It wasn't enough to sustain a penal colony, but it would be plenty for 2 people. And the third reason they chose Floriana was that the island was regularly visited by ships. So much so that they had an area called Post Office Bay, where a barrel had been set up as a mailbox. Sailors would drop off their letters to their loved ones back home and then pick up letters that are headed in the same direction they were going. By going to Floriana, Friedrich and Dora would still be able to keep in touch with family, and should anything go very wrong, they could hop on a boat and leave. But just because boats regularly visited the island didn't mean they visited them often. It could be up to 4 to 6 months between visits, depending on the season. By the time Dora and Friedrich had decided they were going to settle in Floriana, their spouses had already learned about the affair. Reports are that neither were particularly heartbroken over it. Friedrich and his wife were living more like roommates at that point than husband and wife. Before they left Germany, Dora and Friedrich visited with his wife together. And then when they set sail, Dora's husband gave her some money for the trip to Ecuador. Dora had this idea that it would probably work out best for everyone if her husband and Friedrich's wife just got together. He would then have the perfect housewife he wanted, and she'd have a husband to support her. Reports vary, but the most reliable reporting on this does say that not everyone agreed with Dora's view of how things should work out, and they did not get together. Prior to leaving, Friedrich did something else, and that is he removed all of his teeth. He did this for two reasons. One, as a trained doctor, he knew how painful and dangerous oral infections could be, and he didn't want to risk that while on the island. But the second reason was that he had a theory that he could toughen up his gums to the point that they were almost as good as teeth. As a vegetarian, he wasn't thinking about being able to bite into meat, but just rather things they foraged. He did make a set of stainless steel dentures to bring with him, just in case he needed them for eating. With that done and out of the way, on July 4th, 1929, 44-year-old Dr. Friedrich Ritter and his 28-year-old patient, Dora Strock, left for the Galapagos. They sailed from Amsterdam to Ecuador in about 4 weeks. Once they got to Ecuador, though, they learned that boats didn't just ferry out to the islands frequently. They had to wait for a ship that happened to be heading to Floriana and had room for them and their things, which took about another month. After the two were dropped off in Floriana, they had to explore around a bit to figure out where they were going to settle. They wanted a place that was near a freshwater source, and it took about an hour of hiking from the shore before they found the perfect spot. It was a small valley that had a spring, and they named the valley Friedo, which was a mix of Friedrich and Dora. As strict vegetarians, they did not intend on eating any of the birds, turtles, or fish they had around them. And they also didn't plan to eat any of the feral mammals they unexpectedly encountered. Previous attempts to colonize the island had introduced cows, pigs, goats, donkeys, and even cats that were just left behind. So this meant there was competition for the resources on the island that they didn't expect. But Dora and Friedrich didn't plan to live solely as foragers. They had brought seeds with them in order to plant a large garden, so now the issue was to keep the feral animals away from their little farmstead. The two hoped the long growing season would be favorable to growing food year-round since they didn't really have any way to safely preserve it. The Galapagos Islands are pretty much right on the equator, so rather than 4 seasons or even winter-summer temperature switch, they basically have a hot, wet season from December to June, with temperatures in the mid-upper 80s, and a somewhat less warm, dry season from July through November with the temperatures in the upper 70s. The first thing Dora and Friedrich had to do before even starting their garden was to find shelter. Fortunately, there are caves on the island which gave them a covered place to stay while they built their first home, which was basically an open-air hut. And then they turned to trying to prepare a space to plant, and they found that it was not as easy as they had hoped. The Galapagos are volcanic islands, so they spent a lot of time breaking up the hardened lava and clearing rocks from the ground. And that was on top of making sure they gathered enough food every day just to stay alive and active through this work. It left very little time for their idyllic plan of having hours to meditate and write. Friedrich became frustrated with Dora because, as you might remember, she had multiple sclerosis. He had been teaching her for a few years now on how to cure herself with her mind, and in his view, she should have been stronger than the average woman. Instead, she was being pushed to the point of exhaustion with physical labor, and it was actually making her symptoms worse. Friedrich was having to pick up a lot more of the work slack than he anticipated. It ended up taking about a year for them to really have their area habitable and to the point that they actually had spare time every day. Friedrich would spend his hours after chores were done meditating and writing about his philosophical theories. They would both send letters home when ships stopped at the island, and the ships would often leave behind newspapers, so the two at least had something new to read while they were living so isolated. In 1931, after they had been living on the island for about 2 years, they were given a newspaper from a sailor that really surprised them. In it, they found an article about themselves. It seemed the letters they wrote, even though they only got picked up every few months, had been shared with the press, and any detail a reporter didn't know, they just made it up. The stories were definitely exaggerated, both romanticized in some ways, but they also made Dora and Friedrich sound a little unhinged. Some of the articles made them sound like the modern-day Adam and Eve living in paradise, but others made them sound more like Tarzan or the Jungle Book, as though they were feral humans. One thing that was reported in the wrong context was that the couple didn't wear clothing, which was actually mostly true. Ship captains who stopped at the island had learned to call out and let Dora and Friedrich know that they were there so they could put clothing on. But this was more of a practical nudity than a philosophical belief in nudism. The island was covered in lava rock and the bushes were often thorned, so they found out that they had to wear rubber boots as they moved around just to protect their legs and feet. But remember how I mentioned they were at the equator? So imagine wearing rubber boots while it's 85 degrees and humid. They didn't wear clothes aside from the rubber boots for comfort reasons, but it was reported as being another part of Friedrich's weird philosophical teachings, of which he had one disciple, Dora. Being in the papers, though, did get the ships to stop at the island more frequently as people wanted to see Friedrich and Dora with their own eyes. I imagine they didn't exactly get the view they wanted when they found the two to be educated eccentrics rather than two people running around wild in the wilderness. But those who stopped also got a little peek behind the curtain and learned that the self-sufficiency, as reported in the papers, which was reported due to Friedrich's letters, wasn't exactly as described. The two had been getting supplies from the boats that stopped, not just newspapers, and the more ships that stopped, the more gifts they were given. One visiting ship was called the Valero. It was a zoological research vessel headed by a millionaire oil and railroad tycoon, Captain George Hancock. He was charmed by Friedrich and Dora, and he told them he planned to return to the island with more goods for them. Most people who read these stories in the papers thought good for them before going back to modern conveniences they enjoyed. It was a charming enough story about how other people lived, but it definitely wasn't for them. The exception was 41-year-old Heinz Whitmer and his 27-year-old wife Margaret, who in 1932 thought Friedrich and Dora were onto something. They too had thought about leaving Germany. One reason was that the economy was shaky and the uncertainty made Heinz nervous. The second reason was that Heinz had a 12-year-old son from his first marriage who had health problems. It was Dora's recounting of the supposed healing properties of their lifestyle that made them think it was worth a shot. If Friedrich and Dora were the Adam and Eve of Floriana, then they were going to be the Swiss Family Robinson. And Floriana was a good option for them because as they made their plans, Margaret found out she was pregnant. Seeing as Floriana was the only nearly deserted island with the doctor as one of the two residents, it seemed to make sense. The family sold everything they owned in Germany to pay for supplies and passage. So when they arrived on Floriana in August of 1932, they really had no option but to make a go of it, even though Margaret reportedly wanted to turn back. It wasn't the wilderness paradise described in the papers, but rather an entirely undeveloped island with rough terrain. The Whitmers also didn't anticipate how much Friedrich and Dora did not want company on their island, particularly with a family that had little interest in philosophy and meditation. Heinz and Margaret were more down to earth and found the Ritters to be cold, and the Ritters found them to be simple. The Whitmers expected to have the spirit of adventure bond them all together, and maybe they thought the Ritters would at least welcome some extra helping hands, but that is not what happened at all. Friedrich offered to help them find a place to settle and purposely led them to a place that was a solid hour walk from Frito Valley. Friedrich figured they could coexist on the island as long as they had no contact. When Heinz explained to Friedrich that Margaret was pregnant, Friedrich said he was no one's doctor and he walked away. For the next 2 months, the couples managed to stay out of each other's way. And then another boat arrived, with more people ready to settle on the island. After 3 years of being alone, thanks to their family sharing letters with the media, Dora and Friedrich were definitely no longer alone. The new residents were far less welcome than the Whitmers. The person in charge was a woman who said her name was the Baroness Eloise Verborn de Wagner Bousquet of Vienna and Paris, whose biography is iffy. She had a few stories to justify her title, including that she was married to an Austrian royal husband, who she left behind when she decided to go to the Galapagos. It's more likely she was born Eloise Wagner or Eloise Verborn, and she was from Austria, or at least her family was from there. From what's been able to be pieced together, though documentation is shaky on this, she lived in Constantinople during World War I, where she worked as a secretary. At some point, she lost her job and started working in a cabaret where she caught the eye of a French merchant, and this is where she got the surname Bousquet. Eloise then moved to Paris with her new husband, and her mother-in-law did not quite approve of her. She started introducing her young daughter-in-law to other men, including Rudolf Lorenz. The two started a women's clothing boutique together, largely funded by her husband, until he found out that they were actually having an affair. At some point, she had also hired Robert Philipson to work as a clerk in the shop and began a relationship with him as well, in addition to her relationship with Rudolf. Somehow, the self-styled Baroness heard that there was an offer by Ecuador for land in the Galapagos. They worked with the consul to develop a plan to move there. She sold the boutique, keeping some of the silk lingerie, which she would actually wear around the island. When they arrived, the Baroness made it clear that she intended to build a hotel and resort on the island, saying that Rudolf and Robert were there to help her. But she did less work on the hotel and more work on publicizing her story. Friedrich Ritter had enjoyed more visits and gifts after his story hit the papers back in Europe, and the Baroness Eloise had a story even bigger than his, a story of free love with her and her 2 boyfriends and their Ecuadorian servant, Manuel. Manuel is sometimes referred to as another boyfriend of Eloise and sometimes as a servant. It does appear he was paid to live there for 6 months to help her build her home. He doesn't get mentioned much past their arrival in Floriana, and one can hope he just packed up and went home before things turned really dark in our story. It's unclear how old Eloise was, with some contemporary sources calling her young, and others saying she appeared to be in her 40s. And as someone who is in her 40s, I like to think those are the same things, but I have a feeling they're not. When Eloise arrived on the island, it was clear she didn't really care about her neighbors. She found the spot for her hacienda paradise and didn't care that it was in the middle of an area that the Whitmers had already set up as an orchard. And she also didn't care that the Ritters had staked claim to the land, declaring that the entire island was actually hers by virtue of the Ecuadorian land grant she had received. And that meant everything on the island was also hers, including a donkey that the Ritters had taken the time to domesticate. She actually stole the donkey, and then she opted to house it in the Whitmers' garden. Eloise was also one of those people who would climb up a ladder and then pull it up after her. Some newlyweds sailing on the islands accidentally got to Floriana, and she refused to let them onto the island. Another time, a hunter came on the island and she shot at him. He took shelter at the Whitmers' home until Eloise left, and then he ran back to his boat. There are some reports saying that she actually hit him, but that's not the universal telling of the story. The only thing that seemed to bring these 3 factions of people together, very briefly, was the birth of Heinz's and Margaret's son, Rolf. Margaret did not want to ask Friedrich for any help given how rude and cold he had been, but after labor dragged on, Heinz eventually went and got him. Rather than leave her to suffer, to Friedrich's credit, he did come and aid in the delivery, with both mother and son surviving childbirth on January 1st, 1933. Even Eloise was moved by this and brought over some clothing, and Dora gathered food for the family. But this goodwill did not last long. It lasted less than a month. In late January 1933, the Valero arrived for its second visit to the Ritters. Captain Hancock had bought a bunch of gifts and supplies for them, and when he had last been there, it was just Dora and Friedrich living on the island. He had heard through letters about the Whitmers, their new baby, and of course, the Baroness and her lovers. The captain and his crew went out to visit the new settlers, and they found that the Whitmers had pretty quickly adapted to the island, but Eloise was living in practical squalor in spite of having money. She had brought a large sum of traveler's checks with her, and it seems maybe she thought she was going to be able to buy things from passing boats that didn't come as frequently as she anticipated. Eloise also realized with the arrival of the Valero that the Ritters were not living off the land as reported. They were living off gifts and supplies from well-wishers. She sent one of her boyfriends to Friedrich to demand he split everything 3 ways, one share for him and Dora, one for her and her group, and one for the Whitmers. But Friedrich refused. So Eloise turned on her charm with the captain and the crew in the hopes that they would give gifts to everyone the next time they came. And Captain Hancock opted to do her one better. He thought it would be fun to film a short, silent film set on the island and base it on the Baroness's life. It would be a fictional portrayal, but it was definitely inspired by the stories Friedrich had told him about Eloise shooting at people and claiming the island for herself. Eloise was all in, so when the Valero left in February 1933, they had plans to come back with cameras and equipment next time. After they had left, one of the crew members from the ship wrote down his impressions of the inhabitants of the island, and I think it gives us a pretty great view of things. He wrote that Friedrich was resentful of the other settlers, and more so, he was a bit of a troublemaker. He also noticed that Friedrich and Dora were dependent on the supplies from the visiting ships, which took some of the charm and romanticism out of their story. They weren't living on a deserted island cut off from the outside world. The Whitmers, however, were living off the land since Friedrich and Dora wouldn't share supplies with them. And they were remarkable because they were doing so with 2 children, one of whom was a newborn. As for the impressions of Eloise, the crew definitely shared their stories, and they spread like wildfire. A couple living like Adam and Eve on the island was one thing, but a polyamorous member of the Austrian nobility running around in French lingerie while shooting at people who landed on the island, that was a lot more interesting, and Eloise had embellished enough of her backstory that the newspapers had very little more to do. Eventually, the stories in the papers were tales about Eloise becoming the Empress of Floriana and imprisoning the other settlers. When the actual inhabitants of the island read that in the newspaper, they laughed, and Eloise made a comment about where could they have gotten such a ridiculous story. The answer is that she probably planted it herself. The higher her profile, the better her future prospects were. If Friedrich was resentful before, he became even more resentful at this point. Ships came, but they had a little interest in him. Eloise no longer had to ask for help from Friedrich because she was getting her own supplies and gifts. And her talk about building a resort for guests to come to the island was threatening to ruin the reason Friedrich had moved there. In an attempt to get Eloise tossed off the island in May of 1933, Friedrich filed a formal complaint with the Ecuadorian government, using the story about her shooting at a hunter several months earlier as an excuse. The governor of the Galapagos came to the island to investigate and held a short court inquiry into the matter. After meeting with all the parties, he decided not to pursue any criminal charges against Eloise. And more than that, he was swayed by her plans to develop the island to take advantage of all the press they were getting. Tourism equals money for the islands, and so he was willing to give her even more land designated for this development. That isn't to say he didn't formalize the land ownership of the others. He gave the Whitmers and the Ritters 50 acres each for their homesteads. Meanwhile, the Baroness gets several times that amount of land for her resort. Suddenly, Friedrich and Dora's home, where they could live without social boundaries, had property lines drawn. In January of 1934, the Valero returned to the island with the equipment needed to film the short movie that they had promised Eloise, and they called it The Empress of Floriana. Mind you, this was shot 4 years after the last feature-length silent film. And this is a short silent film, only about 5 or 6 minutes long, so it was always just going to be a fun project and not really a serious attempt at making a movie. It was just a chance for more publicity. It is a rather weird film, and the entire thing is shown in the documentary The Galapagos Affair if you are interested in seeing it. The plot was a combination of the stories of the Baroness turning away the newlywed couple and shooting a hunter. Basically, she was cast as a pirate living on the island with her lover, who she was arguing with in the opening scene. A newlywed couple shipwrecks, and while the wife collapses on the beach, the husband ventures further onto the island to look for water. The Baroness, seeing this, sent her boyfriend out to kill them. When he failed to do so, she got angry, grabbed her gun, and gleefully shot the woman on the beach. The husband, however, made it to her house and begged for water. She told him she would give it to him if he did a favor for her. She wanted him to kill her lover. He agreed, and when he finished the job, she gave him water, looked into his eyes, and the two kissed. The film was obviously fun for them to make, and the Valero left with the footage at the beginning of the wet season. But then, the rain didn't come. It got hotter, but not wetter, and by March, 2 to 3 months into the wet season, they were in a full drought, having not had much rain since October of the year before. The fresh water on the island was largely replenished through rain, and the spring had started drying up. Crops were failing, as this was the time of the year that they got most of their moisture, and due to the heat, ships weren't stopping to bring supplies. Things were getting very hard for the Whitmers, who did live off the land and didn't have much food. Things were much worse for the Ritters and the Baroness Eloise and her boyfriend, since they were dependent on the supplies from the ships that were no longer stopping by. It had been observed that prior to this, the Whitmers seemed to be the only truly happy inhabitants of the island, and that may be why they were the family that made it through the drought with their relationships intact. Friedrich, who had never been particularly kind to Dora in regards to her health limitations, got even meaner. There was more work than ever to do just to stay alive, and her MS was flaring under the conditions. He was openly disdainful and resentful of her. But the two still mostly kept to themselves, though, so their relationship issues weren't really anyone else's problem, even though others would observe the tension when they were around. Things were not any better between Eloise and her boyfriends. Eloise and Robert had started pairing off more, regulating Rudolph to the role of servant. He started going to the Whitmers, complaining about mistreatment, and accusing Robert of being physically abusive towards him. This was backed up by Dora, who said that Heinz Whitmer would come by their house every Sunday during the drought for a short visit just to check in with them. One week in March of 1934, Heinz came and said they had to do something about Eloise, as Rudolph was being abused by Robert, either with Eloise's permission or possibly even on her orders. The Ritters wholeheartedly agreed that the Baroness needed to go. They wanted her off the island as much as anyone, but what could they do? When they complained to the governor the last time, not only did she not get in trouble, she became the largest landowner on the island. Dora later said that it was not long after this visit that she and Friedrich heard a sudden shriek and then silence. They listened to see if anything else happened, but nothing did. And then Heinz skipped his next Sunday visit, but then a few days later, Margaret Whitmer and Rudolph showed up with a cake to celebrate Dora's 33rd birthday. Along with the cake, they had some news. They said that after Rudolph and Robert got into yet another physical altercation, Rudolph moved in with the Whitmers. Usually when he would stay with them after a fight, Eloise would come by and convince him to come home. But when she came by this time, she didn't want him back. Rudolph was off collecting wood, so she left a message with Margaret. Due to the worsening conditions of the drought and the lack of progress on her resort, she decided to leave the island with Robert. They were sailing to Tahiti with some Americans who had just stopped by the post office bay in their yacht. They had to leave immediately. Eloise told Margaret that Rudolph was not invited to come with them. She said to tell him that he could have the land and the house, but she wanted him to keep her stuff safe until she could come back for everything. When Rudolph came back and Margaret told him this, he ran over to the Hacienda Paradise to talk to Eloise, but they had already left. He found the house in disarray as though they had packed in a hurry. However, very few things had been taken. Margaret and Rudolph told the Ritters this story, but Dora later said she didn't believe it. From Frito, she had a full view of the bay and hadn't seen a single boat. And being that they were desperate for supplies, she and Friedrich definitely would have noticed a yacht showing up. Dora was also suspicious when Rudolph offered to sell or barter anything the Ritters wanted from Eloise's things. He was trying to get whatever he could to get off the island as fast as possible, uninterested in keeping any of her things safe. Friedrich and Dora went out to the hacienda themselves just to see what was going on. They were surprised to see that Eloise didn't leave just a few things behind. It looked like she left almost everything behind. Even personal and sentimental items she likely would have taken with her. Dora and Friedrich believed the Whitmers and Rudolph were lying about where the Baroness had gone. Dora later wrote that she had to stay quiet out of fear that she and Friedrich were next to disappear if they let their suspicions be known. This was the end of March 1934, and thankfully it started to rain soon after. Everyone turned their attention to getting new crops to grow. As for Rudolph, he moved back into the Hacienda Paradise, but he had most of his meals with the Whitmers. Margaret reportedly indulged this, but not without some judgment. She didn't think it was very German of him to be so dependent on other people. Rudolph stayed on his own for several weeks, and then he moved to Post Office Bay so he wouldn't miss the next boat that came. He was ready to get off the island. By mid-July, a fishing boat captained by Trygve Nugerud of Norway came by. This was a small boat without many supplies to share, but there was a journalist on board, and he was the main reason they were stopping there. Rolf Blomberg wanted to interview the Baroness Eloise. Blomberg first heard about how she had left for Tahiti 4 months previously, but then the Ritters let him know that they never saw the yacht, and they actually didn't believe the two had ever left the island. So rather than report on the people who lived on the island, he was ready to report a different type of story, the mysterious disappearance of 2 people from an island that had a population of 9. There wasn't much time for Rolf to investigate since the crew didn't plan to stay on Floriana for long. When they left, Rudolph went with them, even though they weren't headed to the mainland. Instead, they were going to Santa Cruz Island. But more ships visited Santa Cruz than Floriana, so he had a better chance of hitching a ride to the mainland from there. It might take a few weeks, but that was better than waiting months. Once they got to Santa Cruz, however, Rudolph decided he didn't want to wait weeks. He asked Captain Nubergud to take him to San Cristobal. That's the island closest to the mainland, and it would be sooner that a ship would come by. Captain Nugerud said no, the seas were too rough, but Rudolph offered Nubergud extra money if he would do it right then, and this was a captain who was a known risk-taker, so he agreed. If you're wondering where Rudolph got money, it was likely from Eloise. Like I said before, she had traveled to the island with a large number of traveler's checks, which were pretty popular at the time for international travel, since a lot of countries would take them at face value. I can't find where it says outright that's where he got the money, but it stands to reason. And if he did get the money from Eloise, you would wonder why she didn't take it with her when she supposedly sailed to Tahiti. Rudolph, the captain, and a deckhand set off, but they never made it to San Cristobal. When they didn't make contact, ships in the area checked a few nearby islands in the event they shipwrecked somewhere, but they couldn't be found. It wouldn't be until 4 months later that a fishing boat found 2 bodies on Marchena Island next to an overturned boat. One of the bodies had letters from Margaret Whitmer, so the initial thought was that the Whitmers had tried to leave Floriana and shipwrecked, and these were the remains of possibly Heinz and his older son. But then they got word that the Whitmers were still on Floriana and that the letters had been given to someone else to deliver. Captain Hancock was called by a reporter for comment, since he was known to be in contact with the inhabitants of Floriana. He decided to go to the Galapagos to figure out what was going on. In late November 1934, they arrived at Marchena. They saw the shipwrecked dinghy with a gray coat attached to the pole as a distress flag. They continued on and found the mummified remains of 2 people. And Captain Hancock immediately recognized the clothing on one of them as Rudolph's. The second body fit the description of the captain, and the body of the deckhand who was with them was never found. Marchena Island is nowhere near their path to San Cristobal, so it had not been searched when they were first missing. It's assumed that the currents had pushed them to the island. And this was one of the worst possible places to shipwreck because, 1, the island was far enough north that very few ships passed by to even see their distress flag. And while there were food sources on the island like turtles, there was no fresh water. If it was during the wet season, they could have at least been able to collect some rain to drink, but they landed during the dry season. They likely died of dehydration. News of both Rudolph and the captain's deaths and the Baroness and Robert's disappearances broke in November of 1934 when Rolf Blomberg's reports started getting picked up by a variety of newspapers in any number of languages. Meanwhile, the Valero continued on to Floriana to find out what happened to push Rudolph off the island so abruptly. They arrived on the morning of December 4th, 1934, to learn that there had actually been even more tragedy. Though the rains had eventually come that year, it was too little too late to save the majority of the crops that the settlers had planted. Food, aside from small lizards and other animals that survived the drought, was scarce. Dora wrote that, surprisingly, this was a time of increased peace for her and Friedrich, that he was being more patient and more loving with her as the year passed. The Whitmers, however, remembered this time very differently. Margaret wrote that Friedrich would tell her and Heinz that he and Dora were fighting more than ever and that Dora hadn't been herself in quite some time. And the couple's stress was about to multiply. The scarcity of food meant the chickens they kept for eggs couldn't forage well and they stopped producing. As vegetarians in a season where most of their crops had died, the Ritters were very dependent on those eggs. In desperation, Dora fed the chickens some meat, hoping it would get them to start producing again, but all of the chickens ended up dying, possibly from the meat being bad. So now they had no eggs, no vegetables, no fruit, and just dead chickens. With their only other option being starvation until another ship came, Dora said she boiled the dead chickens so they could eat. According to Dora, shortly after eating the chicken, Friedrich began to feel nauseous. He progressively grew more and more ill, and she worried he had severe food poisoning. After several hours, she went to get the Whitmers for help, but there was little they could do aside from come to the house and try to make Friedrich comfortable. We have 2 very different stories about what happened next. Dora and Margaret both wrote their accounts, and it's almost like they weren't even in the same room. According to Dora, she returned to the house with Margaret Whitmer, and Friedrich's tongue was swollen and he was in obvious pain. She sat at his bedside and prayed over him through the night. Then around sunrise, Friedrich sat up, lovingly reached for Dora with both arms, and then he had a peaceful look before falling back on his pillow, dead. According to Margaret, she realized that Friedrich was very ill and didn't know why Dora hadn't tried to get assistance sooner. Margaret asked what happened, and Dora told her about the chicken, which they had both eaten. And it seemed strange to Margaret that Dora wasn't even a little bit sick from it, while Friedrich was dying. Margaret said that when Dora would try to comfort Friedrich, he would pull away from her. To ease his pain, Dora tried to give him a shot of morphine from the emergency medical supplies that had been given to them, but Friedrich resisted the needle. He was very weak at this point, so Dora did manage to give him the shot. According to Margaret, Friedrich took the pencil and paper near his bedside and wrote his last words to Dora. They were, quote, "I curse you with my dying breath." He soon fell unconscious and died later that night. Like I said, 2 very different accounts. The next day, Heinz Whitmer and his older son dug a grave and buried Friedrich. It was just a week and a half after Friedrich's death that the Valero arrived at Post Office Bay and Captain Hancock had come with the much-needed supplies. He first saw Dora, who told him about Friedrich's death and the disappearances of the Baroness Eloise and Robert Philipson. She confided in him that she thought the Whitmers knew more than they were saying about the Baroness, and she didn't want to stay on the island any longer without Friedrich. She told him about hearing a scream one night before the Baroness disappeared, but she was too distraught to say anything else. Hancock and his crew next went to the Whitmer home, noticing as they approached that the tin roof from Eloise's house was now on theirs. Margaret and Hines repeated the yacht to Tahiti story. Captain Hancock, unsure of the truth, left 3 days later on December 7th, 1934. Dora went with him, taking Friedrich's papers and a few belongings she wanted to keep. Otherwise, she gave the Whitmers everything. Dora's stated goal with returning to Germany was to publish Friedrich's written philosophy, bringing full circle the purpose of the journey to the Galapagos. But she couldn't find any publishers interested in a book on philosophy when they knew there was a much more scandalous story from the island. So instead, Dora sold a memoir called Satan Comes to Eden, and it was published in 1936, chronicling her time on Floriana and vaguely alluding to the murders on the island. Many read between the lines and assumed she was talking about one or more of the Whitmers. Rather than accuse them directly of participating in the murder, she believed that they had grown fond of Rudolph and tried to help him. When he snapped and killed Robert and Eloise, the Whitmers helped him cover it up and dispose of the bodies where they were never found. Dora lived just 7 years after the publication of her story, dying in Berlin in 1943 from complications related to multiple sclerosis. Many years after Dora's death, Margaret published her own memoir called Floriana in 1959. The Whitmers had actually stayed on the island alone, moving closer to the beach after everyone else left. They had a daughter and eventually opened a hotel for passing tourists. An interesting tidbit in her book from a true crime perspective was that Margaret got in her own little jab at Dora, who had already accused her of covering up a murder. She wrote that she found Friedrich's death suspicious, seeing as Dora hadn't gotten sick at all, and hinted that maybe Dora did something to cause him to be sick. As for the Whitmers, their older son Harry died in 1952 in a drowning incident, and about a decade later, Heinz died of natural causes. Margaret lived on Floriana until 2000, when she died at the age of 95, having outlived all of the original settlers by nearly 40 years. And as for Whitmer Lodge, the hotel they built on Floriana, it's still open if you ever happen to be in the area.